The next section of our journey takes us into an interesting category of black box releases entitled the programmable series. Let's start it off with Excitebike. All games in the programmable series included a level editor as a game mode, allowing the player to make custom stages utilizing the mechanics of the base game. Two of these titles came out in 1985, Excitebike and Wrecking Crew, while the third, Mock Rider, would be released the following year in the US. As far as I can tell, the trend of customizable stages started with 1982's Pinball Construction Set, a game for the Apple II by Bill Budge. The game featured different bumpers, flippers, spinners, and more for the player to adjust, and even allowed changes to the gravity and physics of the ball. These creations were saved to a floppy disk and would be playable on other computers, not needing their base software to be downloaded. The game's impact was massive. It sold incredibly well for the time, shipping over 250,000 units after its initial release. Steve Wozniak himself called it the greatest program ever written for an 8-bit machine. Many other creators dashed to get on top of this movement, including Lode Runner for PC and Commodore 64, and Dandy Dungeon for the Atari 8-bit home computer. It was only natural for Nintendo to get in on this trend with this shiny new toy releasing in America. Thus, rather than classifying Excitebike or Wrecking Crew under the Action series, they added level editors and put them in a separate group. While, in theory, the concept of making your own video game levels is quite cool, Nintendo didn't really deliver on the idea, at least in the West. While stage creations could be played while the system remained on, as soon as the power was switched off, they would disappear into the void. While the games did feature a save and load function from the title screen, they never ended up being functional in any way. In Excitebike's manual, a note reads, "Save and load manual selections are not operable in this game. They have been programmed in for potential product developments." This would be an empty promise. While Nintendo did create a Famicom data recorder in Japan, allowing players to save their data to an external disk, this would ultimately never see a release outside of the country, meaning that these features were essentially duds in the American games. Nonetheless, the titles in the programmable series have a lot more going for them than just their customizable options. And that brings us to Excitebike. Excitebike wasn't the first racing game Nintendo created, at least for the Famicom in Japan. F1 Race, a 1984 game developed by HAL Laboratories and published by Nintendo, was one of the titles that never made it over to the West, along with Devil World, Mahjong, and a few others. The reasoning for these cuts, at least for traditional games, was quite straightforward. Culturally, a game like Mahjong would have very little compatibility with the average American, and Devil World was a title that, during a time of general moral panic, would almost certainly stir up controversy upon hitting store shelves. F1 Race, however, seemed at first glance to be a fine fit for North American audiences. This begs the question of why it ended up being replaced by Excitebike in the black box set. Excitebike was designed and directed by Shigeru Miyamoto, creator of Donkey Kong, several games in the original NES lineup, and eventually Super Mario Bros. Miyamoto's style was distinct and effective. He approached video game design from the perspective of an artist rather than a programmer, pushing the limits of technology to create something unique and thrilling. The focus on motorbikes as the vehicle of choice, rather than race cars, which had traditionally been used, is one such design choice that helped Excitebike to stand out. The sprites on the bikes have cute little animations for falling over or jumping off a ramp, and the many different color variations make the game really pop. Cars, on the other hand, feel a lot less personal. The player never really gets to see the drivers, and animations are limited in scope. Mechanically, F1 Race was a perfectly fine game, but it would do little to stand out from the rest of the black box set. Excitebike, on the other hand, had several more defining characteristics that didn't limit it to being yet another simulation. It would be an entirely new experience. The game features 2 modes, bar the design section, each containing 5 tracks. Selection A is a solo time trial in which the player races to complete the track as quickly as possible, hopefully scoring high enough to end up on the winner's pedestal. Selection B adds other racers into the mix, but the win condition remains the same. The computer players act only as obstacles to avoid when trying to finish the course as fast as possible, rather than real racers to compete against. There may not be much in Excitebike in terms of game modes, but what it lacks in variety it certainly makes up for in depth of gameplay. While racing, the A button acts as the acceleration for the bike, while the B button activates a turbo boost, giving a short increase in speed at the risk of overheating the engine. At the bottom of the screen, there's a temperature meter that beeps when it's about to overheat. If the bike does overheat, the player pulls over to the side of the track, waits a few seconds, and then continues onwards. However, this meter resets when an arrow on the course is driven over. In order to beat any of the races, the player must be aware of their engine heat, while still accelerating appropriately in order to make it over tall jumps in the course layout. Speaking of jumps, these features are an integral part to Excitebike's fun. After reaching a jump, the player can control their momentum in the air by pressing forwards or backwards. While landing on the back wheel gives the player a lot more balance and makes it less likely for them to fall over. Depending on where they land, it may be optimal to angle the front wheel down, which maintains as much speed as possible. It's easy to pick up the game and perform well enough, but with enough time, the player gets a real feel for each track and the physics of their jumping and landing. The controls for these movements feel almost platformer-esque. The physics used to determine landing angles are also very precise, akin to the control a player has over Mario jumping in Super Mario Bros., Miyamoto's next big project. The side-scrolling nature of Excitebike also contributes to the platformer feel. While other racing titles, notably Atari's Rally Speedway or Nintendo's F1 Race, had a top-down or behind-the-wheel perspective, Excitebike looked like a matchbox racing track from the horizontal perspective. This worked very well on the NES's technology. While the base system struggled to load certain vertically moving frames, it scrolled sideways without any delay. This can be seen throughout the gameplay of Devil World, also directed by Miyamoto. When the devil moves the screen up or down, it jumps clunkily, skipping out on several pixels. When it moves left and right, however, it goes off without a hitch. This focus on horizontal movement would be seen with many of the Black Box's best titles, notably Balloon Fight, Super Mario, and Gyromite. Overall, the easy-to-play, difficult-to-master nature of Excitebike solidified it as one of the most notable Black Box games. This, combined with its classic Miyamoto charm and excellent level design, helped it age quite well by today's standards. The popularity of Excitebike meant that it saw several re-releases, remasters, and even sequels over the years. Excitebike 64 and Excite Truck were such successors, and although they never performed particularly well, very few games from this era got any sequels to speak of. In addition, the base game got a remaster for Japan's Famicom Disk System, adding customizable options for lap count and multiplayer action. It's also been included in every Nintendo Virtual Console since the Wii, meaning that Nintendo has seen it as an important enough title to keep its legacy alive. Within Nintendo, I would argue that the basis for the Mario Kart franchise is heavily inspired by the likes of Excitebike. Both feature non-traditional vehicle courses, and both brought a new layer of fun to racing games. Miyamoto also went on to produce Super Mario Kart, but was no longer limited by the NES's hardware when designing the game. Speaking of Mario Kart, Excitebike Arena was featured as a downloadable stage in Mario Kart 8, allowing players to experience the course from the driver's perspective. However, where Excitebike's real influence was felt was with the production of Super Mario Bros. The same team created both titles, and the technological knowledge gained from producing Excitebike ultimately led to the masterpiece side-scroller of Mario. Many design features, such as the smooth acceleration when boosting and the jump physics, are clearly present in Super Mario, which takes them to the next level. Excitebike was a game that, by all accounts, feels extraordinarily modern. Its controls are tight, its graphics hold up just fine, and it carries with it a sense of uniqueness not present within previous racing titles. It's clear why Nintendo decided to launch the NES with it instead of F1 racing. Excitebike's charm helps it stand out as a real winner in the Black Box set.